Okay, today in Marine Science Recap, I'm going talking about section 2A in the syllabus, which is ecosystems and niches, and it's also in the book here. It is section 2.1 and 2.2 in the book. And of course, remember, these review videos are no substitute for studying in the book, but it can be a help. So, if it works for you, fine. Let's roll. In the syllabus section 2A, Cambridge write that the student needs to be able to explain the meaning of the term ecosystem, habitat, population, community, species, biodiversity, and ecological niche. And remember, it's always a good idea when you're doing review to look at the Cambridge syllabus, because it's a good idea to use the syllabus as a study guide. So I am going to try to go through these today in a way that will help you. But before we get into the syllabus part, in the book section 2.1 details the difference between ocean, seas and estuary, and that's a good idea to be able to remember as well. An ocean is a huge mass of seawater, we have 5 of them, while seas are a continuous mass of seawater which is partly enclosed by land, which means that seas are more influenced by lands than oceans are. And then we have estuaries, which are the partly enclosed tidal pool of water, which means that there is an interaction here between the fresh water from land and the salt water from the ocean. So for example, in Denmark we have seas around us, but we also have estuaries, many places in our fjords and so on, where the mixing between the salt water and the fresh water has a huge impact on what ecosystems will live there. So, what is an ecosystem? Well, the ecosystem is both the living organisms and the environment they interact with. So, if we up in the lab has a tank with a few fish, some plants, well, that is the ecosystem, but the ecosystem will also be like the water in the tank. It will be the salinity in the tank, it will be the amount of light in the tank. So it's important to remember that the ecosystem here is both the abiotic and the biotic factors. And biotic means living and abiotic is non-living. Biotic factors affecting the ecosystem can be parasites, it can be predation, it can be competition, it can also be symbiotic factors where you help each other. And abiotic factors in the marine environment can be everything from UV radiation to difference in pH, salinity. It can be exposure to air, it can be change in temperature, it can be turbulence, it can be sedimentation. There's many things, and different ecosystems will differ from what biotic and abiotic factors has an influence on them. And when we talk about the different ecosystems, this is often what defines it. What is the difference between a rocky coast and a sandy coast? What is the difference between a hydrothermal vent and a coral reef? It comes down to different abiotic and biotic factors affecting the species living there. And that also helps to determine what species can live there. So a habitat is a natural environment where an organism lives. And here I just give an example of 2 different species in 2 different habitats. We have a large seagull and a small marine crustacean. The seagull lives in the estuaries, which is a habitat with a lot of sunlight. There's mixing of fresh and salty water. There's a high primary production due to photosynthesis, and the temperature and also salinity will change during the day and during the year. And not stated here also, you don't have the high pressure you find in the marine trench. So a seagull living here will be adapted to this kind of habitat. In the deep sea trench, on the other hand, it's dark all the time, it's cold, there is no primary production unless you have hydrothermal vents, so all the carbon or the energy will come as marine snow or whale falls, and there's a constant temperature. So these organisms inhabiting different habitats will be adapted differently to living there. There are many quite different types of habitat in the marine environment, of course, as ocean covers so much and is diverse. But in general, we talk about the habitat an organism occupies can be defined by where it lives and how it moves. And there are three words I'd like you to remember here: planktonic, nectonic, and benthic. Planktonic means if your organism, a planktonic organism, you're just floating and drifting in the ocean. You can't really control it yourself. So for example, plankton is often planktonic. Nectonic means you're active swimmer. That is your tunas, your sharks, most fish species. You can actually swim where you want to be. You can change where you are on the ocean. And then you have benthic, which means living on the seabed or living on rocks, attached to something, or burrowing in the mud at the bottom. But it's important to remember that many species will change their habitat as they grow. For example, our blue mussel will start its life as a larvae, which is planktonic, but then when it's settled, it becomes benthic. Many fish will start as fish larvae, which are planktonic, but then as they grow, they become nectonic, they become active swimmers. Parasite is a special case because for a parasite, the host is often the environment. So if your parasite adapts to a special fish, that fish will be your environment. In science, we often talk about species, and intuitively we often can think about species as something that looks different. For example, one species of penguin will look different from another species. But we can't use morphology as our only guiding line here. For example, a German Shepherd and a small poodle will look very different, but they are in fact of the same species, while some crustaceans can look almost the same to the untrained eye and be of very different species. So in science we use the definition that a species is a group of similar organisms that can interbreed to naturally produce fertile offspring. And fertile offspring is important. For example, a donkey and a horse can breed and make a mule, but that mule is sterile, so it's not a fertile offspring. All species we have given a Latin name. It's what we call a binomial name. It has two parts. The first part is a genus and the second part is a species. Those are always written in Latin, and you always have the two parts. So for example, humans, we are Homo sapiens sapiens. The last sapiens is a add-on, or a wolf can be a Canis lupus. So these Latin names are a way to specify which species we are talking about. There are a few names you'll get to learn in marine, but we'll get into them later. A population are all the individuals of the same species that lives in the same place. So for example, a school of fish can be a population, a bank of blue mussels can be a population, a flock of seagulls can be a population. But if they are not in the same place, we will see them as different populations, or maybe sub or meta populations. So in population biology, there is something we often talk about, and that is something we call carrying capacity. And I'll try to illustrate it here on my old whiteboard with my old whiteboard markers here. So let's say we have here the number of a population of something that could be blue mussels, and this is time. So now we have some rocks, and they are We clear them of everything. There's no blue mussels on them, and then the larvae start coming in. So in the beginning, it'll take a little time, but then the amount of blue mussels will really start increasing. More and more blue mussels will start settling. There's plenty of food for them. There's still places to live. But this kind of growth cannot continue. If that would continue, eventually there'll be more blue mussels living there than there are stars in the universe, and that would be a bad thing. So eventually some factors, biotic or abiotic, will start to slow our population growth, and eventually we will start to approach here what we call the carrying capacity. That is the maximum number of blue moths that can live here. And that could be due to competition for space, that could be due to competition for food, it could be predation, it could be infectious disease, it could be many things that limit how many that can live there. This is a textbook example that it just goes like this. And in reality, if we have a carrying capacity here, we might get a small overshot, and then it goes under again and up again, something like that. So, and again, our carrying capacity doesn't have to be the same at all time. It can be different at different times of year. But it's important to remember that there's a limit to how large a population can be, and when we have the population at its maximum capacity, we have it as its carrying capacity. Yep. So in marine science, a community is an association of all the different population of species occupying a habitat at the same time. For example, our blue mussels are part of a community, but so are the seagulls and sea stars who prey on them, and so are the algae that they eat. So they are all a part of the same community. Biomes are communities that extend over large areas of the globe, and they are classified according to the predominant vegetation. For example, on land, that could be temperate forest. In the ocean, that could be a mangrove forest, that could be a seagrass forest, that could be a kelp forest, or that could be a coral reef. And the last word that we need to introduce here is biodiversity. And we'll get into much more detail later on why this is so important. But biodiversity is a number on how many different species is living somewhere. For example, if we look at a huge bank of blue mussels, there are a lot of blue mussels living there, and if you look at weight of biomass, it's very high, but the biodiversity might not be very high because there's only a few species living there. On the other hand, coral reefs often have extreme high biodiversity, and later on we'll get into why that is so. Ecological niche is one of the words we also use a lot, and it's often a little harder to understand than species, community, and population. The ecological niche is defined as a role of a species within the ecosystem. So, for example, the shark has a role of, its niche is the role of a top predator. And we define these things here both on feeding relationship, who's eating who, on the spatial relationship, do they occupy the same zone or a different zone? For example, different mussels will grow at different height of a rocky coast. And also on the temporal relationships, are they here at the same time? Some species are active at night and other species are active during the day. So for example, if we look at a great white shark and a whale shark, they are both very big sharks. But if we look at the feeding relationship, they occupy a different ecological niche. While the great white shark is a top predator, the whale shark is mainly a plankton feeder. So while they're both big sharks, they will occupy different ecological niches.